She's here, said the headlines, and everyone knew they meant the American film star with the famous shape and the wiggly walk.
In 1956, Olivier invited the Hollywood sex symbol Marilyn Monroe to Britain for his new film, The Prince and the Showgirl.
Olivier and his wife, Vivien Leigh.
That would have been a perfect film with Vivien and Larry, but it was much bigger box office to say Laurence Olivier and Marilyn Monroe, you know, that was the big deal.
Laurence Olivier was definitely charmed by Marilyn Monroe. And Vivien Leigh told me, oh, the silly boy thinks he's going to have an affair with her, but I don't think that'll happen, she said with glee.
Olivier was smitten. He ignored warnings about Marilyn's reliance on the American method school of acting, where performance was inspired by the actor's personal experience rather than the director's guidance.
His intolerance of the method I entirely approve of. And for an actor to indulge himself by being true and then say, what do I have to say, oh, to be or not to be, I don't feel like saying that, which is a parody of the method, you know, but it's an illustration of the absurdity of it. And Olivier was such a fine technician that he had little patience with that kind of indulgent massaging of the ego.
He spent 20 minutes describing the scene, how it should be played, and she listened with that rather stony look on her face. And while they were making her up, her coach came up, the method coach, you know, Strasbourg, came up and said, no, remember, darlings, think of Frank Sinatra and Coca-Cola. So all the fine things that Larry had told about the motivation of the scene went overboard, and she forgot her lines.
This way. There was one scene in which Marilyn simply couldn't get right. It was a lot of walking, you see, and at the very end of the scene, when she goes into the room, she has to say the line, wow, I'm shaking. This is worse than the first night.
Oh, gosh, another one?
She knew she had a line coming up. It's just that it had floated away a little bit.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and then she'd lose it, you see. and in the wrong order. Well, that meant we had to take that particular scene 29 times before we managed to get it.
I'm shaking. This is worse than the first night.
The relationship got worse and worse. He shouted at her once when she was so late. She came on the set maybe an hour or two late, and Larry called out, why can't you come on the set in time, for fuck's sake? And she said, oh, do they use that word in England too?
He said, it's absolutely the worst experience of my professional life. He said it came close to putting me in bed.
Battered by his experience with Marilyn and suffering in a deeply traumatic marriage, Olivier returned to Shakespeare. Here on stage, he still had plenty to teach the rising generation of actors.
For his death in Coriolanus, he was up on top of an archway, sort of kneeling, and his great enemy, Aufidius, was down there, and with his last dying breath, he launched himself through the air at Aufidius and twisted in the air as he went, so that he finished up hanging upside down with his face towards the audience, hanging by his ankles from the archway.
There was a gesture he used brilliantly when he said, whip me, ye devils, from the possession of this heavenly sight.
Whip me, ye devils, from the possession of this heavenly sight!
And did that.
Don't of liquid fire!
And I used to do it myself. Terrible admission.
The royal banner and all quality, pride, pomp, and circumstance of glorious war!
When he did Othello, that he proudly said he'd found 2 or 3 more bass notes in his voice.
Dost thou mock me?
I mock you, no, by heaven.
I was feeling frustrated by the boredom of my career. I stood for everything that the young generation would find most objectionable. More and more, my impulses were to create a condition of detachment from my marriage, and a sharp change in the direction in my career might help me form such a wedge.
There was always a side of Laurence Olivier that was terrified of becoming Ham. He was always trying to update his image and do new things to avoid that. And in a way, when he did The Entertainer, he was confronting this fear by actually playing a real Ham actor.
The Entertainer, written by angry young playwright John Osborne, tells of a declining music hall comedian out of touch with post-war Britain. It came uncomfortably close to mirroring Olivier's life.
What happened was he read the script and his part absolutely leapt out to him as a part. I can do that. I know I can do that. I know that man. So he was so brilliant doing it.
Why, oh, why should I bother to?
He appalled most of his elderly fans. Suddenly he was playing this slightly obscene, seedy music hall comic. And I think his readiness to shed that support was enormously brave of him.
And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because look at my eyes. I'm dead behind these eyes.
They did look dead. It was tragic. It was a chilling, terrifying moment.
Oh, if you learn it properly.
He once said something quite subtly. He didn't think we were put on this earth necessarily to be happy. People who are lonely are very good at disguising it. I think he was lonely a lot of the time, yeah. But you learn to be more outgoing than you really are.
Talk to me.
The Entertainer was exactly the tonic that his career needed. He was fashionable once more, and he and his young co-star Joan Plowright had fallen in love.
Joan introduced him to the new wave of English drama. The Entertainer, the angry young men. And he absolutely adored that. It was wonderful for him.
Laurence Olivier was already committed to an East European tour with Vivien Leigh. She knew all about his affair with Joan Plowright.
For the most part, in public, they maintained this elaborate facade of the ideal theatrical couple.
She did get steadily more and more unbalanced and more hysterical. When we were in Yugoslavia, she decided she didn't want to leave Yugoslavia, ever. And she wouldn't get on the train. And in the end, the chief of police of Belgrade, where we were, picked her up and put her on the train physically. And she just went pow and popped him right in the eye and gave him a beautiful black eye.
She was up all night because there would be various nightclubs. There was one in Zagreb, and Vivien was always there. She was on a great high of energy.
She would dance with strangers, she would flirt with strangers, she would do solo dances on nightclub floors and generally drink a bit too much. Poor Laurence Olivier said to try and pretend it wasn't happening.
By the time the Oliviers celebrated the wedding of Vivien's daughter Suzanne, her illness had brought the marriage to breaking point, and the press began to report rumors of mental problems.
I think she was already becoming unbalanced, going too far. And I think that it was embarrassing and difficult for him and counterproductive.
During her campaign to save a much-loved London theatre, Vivien very publicly wore a black eye patch. She told reporters that it covered an insect bite, but in fact she and Olivier had fought at Notley over his affair with Joan Plowright.
That was a terrible time. I mean, there were fights. I don't want to talk about them, but I mean, there were fights. Quite rough.
Sorry, fights between?
Larry and Viv. I mean, she attacked him sometimes. A bit rough.